Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Hey everyone, welcome to this chapter 3, 4 of Exploring the Hobbit chapter episode. That's what I meant to say, because this is an important chapter because we're fixing everything Tolkien got wrong in chapter 1. I mean, Tolkien is fixing everything he got wrong in chapter 1.
Who do we think we are? Rings of Power?
Oh, we're not that good.
Nobody is.
Nobody is. No, we are going through Tolkien's partial rewrite of chapter 1 of The Hobbit, an unexpected party, except here he's calling it a well-planned party.
And this was 1960, right?
1960 is when he started it and abandoned it. He has he went through 2 chapters. However, the 3rd chapter, I believe, is even less finished. So we'll do the same thing. We'll go through, once we go through chapter 2, we'll also go through his new rewritten chapter 2. And these changes some of them did make their way into the 1966 slightly revised edition. But there are far more revisions in here. In fact, there is just a general change and sort of, high perspective changes. We're looking down from a high mountain, and we're seeing like, oh wow, yeah, the whole tone and things that changed in The Hobbit, and it's really interesting. So listen to that. But we have a couple things to go over first. Number one, hey guys, become a member. theonering.com/member, theonering.com/Patreon. It's $4 a month. First month is free. We have an extended podcast. We have a Discord channel. I have occasional video chats. I've done it a little bit more. Well, recently it hasn't been the last couple of weeks, but last month or so, but when I've been editing the podcast, I'll jump on and see if anybody else is on and wants to chat with me as I'm editing the podcast, which is kind of fun. But go to theonering.com/member for $4 a month. First month is free. So you can cancel it if you don't like what we say. And you're triggered in our extended episodes.
Right. Definitely be triggered.
That can happen because we're going to trigger you by actually trying to find out one good thing in the Hobbit films. The Hobbit films in the extended podcast. Right. We're talking about what is the one thing that Peter Jackson changed that probably wasn't a bad idea that we kind of liked.
The Tauriel Killy love affair. Thanks. Is not my choice.
Oh, woo! Oh. Man, I was about to cancel the entire podcast if you were going to go that direction.
I noticed through this read that Killy and Philly have tools with them. They're the only dwarves with tools. They're the only dwarves that work, apparently.
Yeah. I love those little things that, the things that logically he added into the rewrite here. We're like, and we talked about one of these last week in the instruments. Right. Like, the instruments. How are they?
Yep, he thought about that. Yep.
So we'll name a good change in The Hobbit. We will name a change that Tolkien should have changed in The Hobbit. Like, looking back on it now, maybe there's one thing he should have changed in The Hobbit. And not Peter Jackson, what Tolkien should have changed in The Hobbit, in our opinion. And and we have a question like, how much do we prefer our preferred version of The Hobbit? Is it the 1960 edition, like the style, the tone that Tolkien kind of shifted to in that? Or is it the 1937/1966 edition where the similarities are far more in sync with itself rather than with Lord of the Rings in a way? So we'll talk about that in our extended edition. Go to theonering.com/member to get that for a month for free. All right. So before we get into this rewrite of a chapter, we do have to talk about one thing, and that's fairy rabbits.
Yes,
the fairy rabbits.
And so remind our listeners, wow, the hubris of me.
That's fine. Maybe some people are they see the words visually as they're hearing them. They're reading them,
and maybe they read along with us when we're reading The Hobbit. So this was criticism leveled by a book critic when The Hobbit was first released, 1937, I think. And
well, I don't know if it was a criticism. It was people were assuming they were sort of these fairy rabbits, is the way he put it.
Yeah, Hobbits were new, so nobody knew what they were. And I thought there was one critic who started it who talked about how he imagined hobbits as fairy rabbits, and so we mentioned this last episode.
And so we had a few folks in our chat and me jump in and decide to be like, okay, what would a fairy rabbit look like with AI? Because AI, the overlords are coming, might as well get in sync with them now with the Lord of the Rings.
I, for one, am fully support our new alien overlords.
Well, then you'll be fully supportive of things like this fairy rabbit. And if you're listening, I will put the links in the show notes below. There are going to be like 5 or 6 images we'll have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 images. Fairy
There
rabbit.
it is.
There it is, a hobbit. You can even see the little hobbit hole in the background.
We call them furfoots.
This is from Harrison in our chat. That is very good. I like the wings. It's Peter Rabbit as a fairy hobbit. It's like all right. So
was that the prompt? Did he use Peter Rabbit?
He didn't. He didn't tell me the prompt for it, so I'm not sure offhand.
Okay.
This here is from Fra. He did a fairy rabbit. This is a very casual. Let me zoom in on it a little bit. It's a very casual hobbity rabbit. He's just kind of hanging in front of his hobbit hole.
Sweet.
Then I got this one, and him kind of smoking on a bench in front. This is very
smoky. Is that a pipe or
it's
a cigarette?
Like a cigarette. I said pipe, but it's AI. It's not gonna like be perfect every single time.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah. But he's sitting on his bench in front of his house smoking. Next we got another one here. This is
he has very human hands, this one.
I know. I was trying to go for that. I said, okay, give me a I don't remember the exact prompt, but it was something along the lines of a fairy rabbit in the style of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, with a human body or with an oversized human body or something like that. So in order to kind of get it more of like a fairy rabbit, like something that's a little more hobbity rabbity. So that's
right.
What we go with this one. So, but
this kind of looks like a version of Doctor Who with a rabbit head.
You're so right. Which version of Doctor Who? The more recent one?
He's the furry. He's the 16th Doctor.
Good Lord. It's okay. Good. All right, next one we got here.
He's coming soon. Oh,
this is
no.
with Gandalf. Some fairy hobbits, rabbits with Gandalf. They are, this was, yeah. Or, no, this was Elrond. I think the prompt was with Elrond in Rivendell.
I was going to say, this doesn't look like Gandalf.
They look like a mixture between dwarves and hobbits, honestly. Like a dwarf hobbit rabbit mixture.
His hair.
Especially the guy on the right.
His hair is giving me the Denethor vibe from the movie.
Yeah, I know. It's so weird, man.
Which I actually appreciate the weirdness part more. Like the world of fairy is not actually supposed to be like little fairies with fairy wings. It's a alternate world that imposes itself upon ours sometimes, and it has a lot of mystery and oddity to it. So this would, except for the Easter Bunny to his right,
and that's sort of weird. They just threw that in with the bow tie too, which is cool.
Right. Right.
And then lastly, they all have regular people hands, but rabbit feet. So
very interesting.
Okay. Lastly, here we go. This is sort of like the Fellowship of Fairy Hobbits. It's Sam in the middle.
I like how you got the port. They're a little more portly. I like these ones.
Yeah, these ones might have been. This one feels like a diorama. Look at the grass is so short or something like that. So in any case, this was kind of fun. But this is not what Tolkien envisioned as hobbits. These are not fairy rabbits. They are indeed hobbits.
I like how one of them has human hands and the other two don't.
Yeah, I know. It's
AI is so weird.
I don't know where they get this sometimes. So, all right, cool. So there you go. Yeah.
What did you use? Is this Midjourney?
This was Stable Diffusion. This was I'm not sure. I'm not sure who used what here. I just used the local build of Stable Diffusion in order to build it. So
got it.
So I didn't have to pay anybody for it. All right. So let us then, now that we're done with fairy hobbits, let's get into
Hobbit facts.
Hobbit facts. Okay, did you know, everybody, that Tolkien actually invented the word dwarves? That would be DWARVES. Dwarves, not dwarfs, but dwarves. And why did he invent it? Well, according to his own words, it was a result of bad grammar. That was his word. So let me read you this quote from a letter he sent to Stanley Unwin, his publisher, on October 15th, 1937. He said this: "No reviewer that I have seen, although all have carefully used the correct dwarfs, DWARFS themselves, has commented on the fact, which I only became conscious of through reviews, that I use throughout the, quote, incorrect plural dwarves. I am afraid is just a piece of private bad grammar, rather shocking in a philologist. but I shall have to go on with it. Perhaps my dwarf, since he and the gnome are only translations into approximate equivalents of creatures with different names and rather different functions in their own world, may be allowed a peculiar plural. The real historical plural of dwarf, like teeth of tooth, is dweros. Anyway, rather a nice word, but a bit too archaic. Still, I rather wish I had used the word dwero. He just likes the archaic. So it's funny that dwarves, as we all call it, like dwarfs seems weird now with the FS, but VES seems far more normal because he normalized it in
because Tolkien did it. Yes,
because it was a private piece of bad grammar. So
that's awesome.
But he accepted it, and he fought this for years. So even later, in 1961, in a letter to Rainer Unwin, you'll note the previous letter was to Stanley Unwin, Rainer's father, who was the original publisher of The Hobbit. He said this: dwarves with an apostrophe, and dwarvish have been corrected throughout. He's talking about a copy of The Lord of the Rings. They have been corrected throughout, with one exception on page 21, to the current dictionary forms dwarfs and dwarfish. Elvish and Elvish has been changed to elfish 7 times, but unchanged 3 times. I view this procedure with dudgeon, which means indignation. I deliberately use dwarves for a special purpose and effect. Aha. Is he changing the past right there? Is he remembering it differently? He said, I deliberately use dwarves, etc., for a special purpose and effect. That it has an effect can be gauged by comparing the passages with the substitutes dwarfs, especially in verse. The point is dealt with in Lord of the Rings, page 415. Of course, I do not expect compositors or proofreaders to know that or to know anything about the history of the word dwarf, but I should have thought it might have occurred, if not a compositor or at least to a reader, that the author would not have consistently getting on for 300 times a particular form, nor would your readers have passed it. It was a mere casual mistake in grammar, if it was a mere casual mistake in grammar. So he's like, look, it wasn't like a typo for 300 times in the book. I said dwarves on purpose at this point. Although his memory is a little bit iffy that he says I did it for a special purpose and effect.
Well, I don't think so. I'm gonna defend him on this one. I think that if faced with his previous letter to the Unwin father, Stanley's the father?
Stanley Unwin is the father, yes.
Yeah. He would probably rightly point out, yes, back then it was a mistake and I went with it and I decided I had to go with it. And then I wrote some new books and that was a deliberate choice. And in other words, when he's responding to the first Unwin, he's responding with regard to Hobbit. By the time he writes the 3 new books, this is a deliberate choice.
No, I know. Yeah.
He is doing it for
originally it might not have been a deliberate choice. It was more of it
was a mistake.
Piece of private bad grammar. Yes. In the Lord of the Rings it is a deliberate choice. However, at this point in the Hobbit where we are, it is not used for special purpose and effect.
No. But I like the sound of it better, and I agree with him. I agree with him on verse. Like when you try to chant or sing the word dwarfs instead of dwarves.
Yeah,
it just the F sound is difficult as an ending sound.
It's sort of like, I don't believe the word is roofs, right? But a lot of people say the word roofs, even though it's roofs, because the FS is a little tough.
The word roof or rough or roof is pronounced differently in different regions of the country, of America anyway, and in England too. So interesting. But dwarves are now dwarves, and everyone uses it. I can say pretty firmly that basically everyone uses dwarves as the plural of dwarf.
Right. Although I'm trying to think of other FS words, and hoofs goes to hooves. So it's not out of the ordinary that this here.
And roof goes to roofs.
Yeah. In any case, I love this little bit of information. He created the word dwarves, VES, and we still use it, and everybody uses it. And now it's been changed so much that when you see dwarfs, FS, it feels a little weird, especially in fantasy. It feels a little weird. Anyway, there you go. That is and I love this little video, this little Hobbit singer. Thank you, Austin. Thank you, Fra, for putting these together. That is your weekly
Hobbit Facts.
That's right. Well, it's only one this week, but these are your Hobbit Facts every week that we put together. All right. So let's get into...
I'm looking forward to late August, early September when we go back to the Rings of Power and we do a Hobbit Facts. And our first Hobbit fact will just be the flipping pages Hobbit facts, and then just show a picture of the dirty little sociopaths. These are not hobbits.
These are not
the
hobbits.
end. That's the end of our Hobbit facts for this week.
Oh man, yeah,
Not hobbits.
That's going to be great. All right, this is interesting. I've never done this before. I've never compared somebody's revision to their original or vice versa, an original to
never. I never have either.
And so this is a little bit of an experiment for us to try and see how we get through this here. So here's what we're going to do.
Start large.
We're going to go sort of wide so you guys have a perspective of what it is. And we'll read some passages in here, I'm sure, as we get through it. There's a lot to read, so we can't, there's a lot of little changes in the 1960 edition, which you can get by buying The History of the Hobbit. I think it's a $20 Kindle book and like a $40 print book. If you can actually get it. I ordered it 4 weeks ago now, I think it is, and it still hasn't shipped, so I'm not sure when it's coming in. But if you want to read it, that's where you get it from. It's a 1,000-page book about the Hobbit, but one section has these chapters in it. All right, so 30,000 foot perspective. We're looking way down on the changes that Tolkien made. He came to it and was like, I got to change a lot of this here.
Yep.
And so here's my first thought. We'll talk about it, and then let's go to your first thought, Michael. And then after we'll go to specific thoughts, and then more some of the removals and changes that he did in the text itself. It is a little more concise in general. Everything is a little more concise. That's one of the things I took away from it. And I have a couple. This is hard to do because my highlights are all in different places. But I have a couple highlights to exemplify that. And one is when the good morning statement, which was a little surprising when I read this, is totally different. So in the original Hobbit, when Gandalf says, when Bilbo says good morning to Gandalf, Gandalf's response is, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" He said, "Do you wish me a good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" That's the original. Here's the rewritten text. "What do you mean?" he said, "that it is a fine morning and you feel pleased with yourself? Perhaps you wish me to feel pleased too. I may. We'll see." It was like, whoa. Well, it kind of changes the meaning too, but it is much more concise. There's far less wordplay in this and thought process that you have to do in order to understand it. Like, it's very direct. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Right. And there's some missing text at the end of their conversation where he talks about giving him what he wants in the original version, and he just leaves that out entirely in the rewritten version.
Yeah.
So that whole wordplay is completely gone. I found that to be sad. He's less playful. My overarching feel of this is more serious and concise, less playful. That's my big picture. Analysis.
Yeah, that's very similar to mine. Mine was more concise, more stately, and less charming. There's a charm to
charming.
The Hobbit.
Okay.
You lose that. But playful is one of the words that was out there for me too. But charming was the word that I used. Here's another example of where I think he's more concise and less charming. This is about adventures. I'm looking for. Gandalf says, I'm looking to share an adventure, and Bilbo responds with this. "I should think so," meaning. It's difficult to find anyone to share an adventure. He said, Bilbo said this, "I should think so. In these parts, we are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them." And in the rewritten one, he says, I should think so. In these parts, we are plain, quiet folk and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing things make you late for dinner. And I'm like, the only word he changed here is he got rid of the word uncomfortable, but he still made it more concise. He's like, that one word, we're just going to remove that. And I found that in quite a few places where he just removes one word, or he just removes one short phrase. And so while not a lot has changed here, he just removes uncomfortable. They're just nasty, disturbing now, not nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things. I have a couple more examples too. I don't know if we want to keep going through those, but those places where he removes those words, that's really what stuck out to me when it comes to just the conciseness. Now, I think we can talk about that, the other higher level things too. Like, I think
there's to harp on the lack of playfulness. One of the sad parts is, to me, another sad part is he, in the excitable little fellow, which is changed from excitable little man, from the 1937 version, but Excitable Little Fellow remained. It was one of the few from the 1960 rewrites that remained. But he says, this is after Bilbo has shrieked, and Gandalf says, Excitable Little Fellow, and this is the version that we know, except for the word fellow. As they sat down again, gets funny, queer fits, but he is one of the best, as fierce as a dragon in a pinch. If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, you will realize this was only poetical exaggeration applied to the Hobbit, even to any Hobbit, even to old Took's great-granduncle Bullroarer, who was so huge for a Hobbit that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins at Mount Graham in the Battle of the Greenfields and knocked their king Golfenbull's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won and the game of golf invented at the same moment. Very hilarious and playful. The new version, he takes out brave as a dragon in a pinch, and he immediately jumps to the bull roarer, who he gives his full name, or at least his first name, Bandabras. And he says, as brave as Bandabras at a pinch, no doubt an exaggeration, but Gandalf was doing his best in a difficult situation. For Bandabras had been the old Took's great-granduncle, and usually called Bullroarer. He was so huge for a hobbit that he rode a small horse. At the Battle of the Greenfields, when the hobbits were driven back, he charged the ranks of the goblins of Mount Graham, and smote their king Golfenbull to the earth with his great wooden club. So the battle was won, and there had been none since in the Shire. Even the dwarves had heard of Bullroarer Took. So he completely cuts out the golf reference, and he adds in a few other details, like when the hobbits were driven back. And in other words, he's kind of giving you a more epic take, like the hobbits are about to lose, and then Bullroarer comes in, and he does something much more realistic, which in one sense, which is he crushes them to the ground. It's not quite realistic to knock a head off of a person 100 yards. So the rewrite is more serious, less playful, and sad in my mind, because it removes the whole golf
and
thing.
Also brief. That's probably the best example of he
Yes.
excises the things that he finds less important. Yeah, it is like reading it. It made me honestly a little sad. Like, oh, it's just not as fun anymore. It's not a story that pulls me in like it as a kid, even as an adult, even as much. It just doesn't. Like that when the whole good morning, that was the first tip to me when he got rid of the good morning line, that his attitude towards the world had changed completely, and he felt like that was out of place now. Exactly.
And I mean, little things like he changes the word Gandalf when the final four dwarves and Gandalf are at the door, and Bilbo opens the door suddenly, and they all come piling in. In the original version, as Gandalf berates him for opening his door like a pop gun, he says, and then in the rewrite he changed it to open your door like a trap, which is just, I mean, first of all, I understand, because you're removing, you could say, well, he's removing the reference to something much more modern, and so, which is the first thing I thought. But the second thing I thought was, opening your door like a pop gun is playful. Opening your door like a trap is not. So there's just a whole and even Gandalf's when Gandalf talks about his own attempt to find someone as their 14th companion, in the version that we read right now, which he eventually stayed with, Gandalf says things like, "That would be no good," said the wizard, "not without a mighty warrior or even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands. In this neighborhood, heroes are scarce or simply not to be found." And then he goes on to talk about how Hobbit weapons aren't really weapons; they're just used as tools. Which there are some changes in that too. And in the new version, he says, "That would do no good," said the wizard, "not even for warriors of the elder days who cannot now be matched. But we have discussed all that. Anyway, we're not looking for a warrior in the Shire." And that's it. And then he goes on to talk about how their swords are blunt, their axes are used for trees, and etc. So he just cuts out the whole part of him trying to find a mighty warrior or even a hero, and warriors are busy fighting another in distant lands, and in this neighborhood, heroes are scarce. and that all he makes a reference to warriors of the elder days, capital E, capital D. And he does that a couple times, like Bilbo says, his voice goes into a whisper, and he says, when he's talking about the effect Gandalf has had on the Shire, he says, that you've even taken people on adventures to the capital O, other capital S shores, other shores, says in a whisper, which is probably a reference to Valinor and the Elder Days. So Tolkien is clearly bringing in references to the Middle Earth here. But the fact that he takes that whole funny description about him trying to find a hero or a warrior, and they're not to be found, and they're fighting each other and stuff, just more playful. Tolkien just takes that out and just says, but we've discussed all that. And anyway, we're not looking for a warrior in the Shire. Very concise, very, very, very truncated, less playful.
Yeah, and it even starts with the very first description of Gandalf from the Hobbit. If you remember when he says Gandalf, when Gandalf appears, Tolkien writes, Gandalf, if you would have heard the things that we've heard about Gandalf here, let me read that to you. This is how he describes Gandalf. Gandalf, if you had heard only a quarter of what I've heard about him, and I've heard only very little of all that there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place wherever he went in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way under hill for ages and ages. Okay, so that's where it goes on. This is how he says it in the well-planned party, not the unexpected party, because now this chapter is much more well-planned, in fact. He writes this: at that moment, Gandalf appeared. Gandalf, those who go in for ancient history, capital A, capital H, will prick up their ears, although few know all that there is to tell about him. Wherever he went, strange things happened, and he left behind him marvelous tales. And here you get rid of the lines about if you'd only heard a quarter of what I've heard about him, and I've only heard very little of all there is to hear, you'd be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. It sets him up as a much bigger figure. Though he described him as a small man in the original Hobbit, he had a large impact. And here it's almost he's diminishing his impact in the way that he refers to him, because he's all about ancient history and marvelous tales. Not the words that he gets rid of are remarkable tale, extraordinary fashion, tales and adventures sprouted up. They didn't just they weren't part of a history book. They sprouted up wherever he went. And so it's a much more visceral Gandalf. He is involved. He is creating adventures. And so the adventure he's bringing Frodo on makes it seem much more of an impact in the world right now, not just part of ancient history. And so that's the charm that's gone. Like, Gandalf is no longer this wizard who is coming in and is going to suck him up out of his life and throw him on a grand adventure, which he's known for, and you can't even quite recount because they're so great. You lose that in the rewrite in 1960.
I also found he got more specific on numbers. He put in lots more numbers that he wasn't. I have just 3 examples to illustrate it, but there are more. He points out that Bilbo's, in the rewrite, he points out that Bilbo's parents died around 80 years old, which he just didn't have in the 37 or the 66 version. He said they died young, at 80 years old, which is young for hobbits. And so he's concerned more with years. He says in the original version, he says dragons, when Thorin's talking about dragons, he says they live practically forever. And in the new version, in the rewrite, he says they live 1,000 years, maybe. In the old version, he makes no mention at all of how long ago he found the map from Thorin's father. But in the rewrite, it's very specific, and he says 91 years ago he's guarded it. So he's clearly very concerned with timelines, as we know that he is with the Lord of the Rings, where he spends a long time in the appendices trying to make timelines work. And that I saw that bleed over a little bit into the Hobbit rewrite. Yeah,
that specificity is important, is interesting. He's far more aware of it now than he was when he wrote it for his children and told it and then put it down, because it wasn't a part of the greater overall story. I mean, he at this point, when he wrote The Hobbit, he didn't have the Rings of Power and the Third Age and the Second Age and how Sauron took, like, that was not created at the point that he wrote The Hobbit.
Right.
And so now there's this great ancient history that we just talked about. It's already there. And so specificity is important. And that isn't only in numbers. That's also in explaining how they got their instruments. Because
yes.
because one of the things we talked about, and one of the things our members brought up last week, is like, where did they get these instruments from? Do they just go around carrying instruments? Well, I guess so. And in fact, Tolkien added that in there. And so when Beaufort and Bomber appear, they say, "At your service," said Beaufort, Beaufort, and Bomber, a little coolly standing in row. And then Tolkien added this: "They brought in a large bag and what looked like sticks wrapped in cloths, which they put in the hall stand. Those sticks wrapped with cloths are the instruments that they use later to play in his parlor, right, when they're singing their songs."
Yes.
So that specificity, like, he can't leave things out that wouldn't make sense later. Like, he had to add those things back in.
So let me ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that with some of those things, it doesn't really make a difference to the playfulness versus the seriousness. Like, clearly when he never completed his rewrite, and maybe that's why a lot of these changes never made it into the 1966 version that we're all most familiar with. But do you think that he was deliberate about not putting in some of those things? I just don't see the benefit of not putting in that one line, for example, about the instruments. Like, it doesn't hurt anything. He talks about the specificity of them hanging up their cloaks and tassels, the cloak and tassel colors and all that stuff. So why wouldn't keeping the bag in there? And then other ones, like, which are clearly just sort of mistakes, like the one I read where he says "excitable little fellow," where we talked about last week, how it was another author of another series entirely that pointed out that he admired, that pointed out to him that this is do you mean man? Because he said "excitable little man," and the other author points out, do you mean fellow? And so he changed that to fellow. But then the following paragraph, he uses the word man 3 times to describe Bilbo. Gandalf does. And so when he's talking about going to find a man, and now he's found a man, and it's a burglar, and etc. But he left those in. Do you think he did that all on purpose, or do you think he was just couldn't be bothered, like he just threw away the rewrite, and so a lot of even its most meaning, or the changes that made the most sense and didn't remove the playfulness, also went by the wayside? Was it accidental or on purpose
that he left man in there?
Left man in there, that he didn't put in the rewrite about the line about the instruments in the bag?
No, he added the instruments line, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but he didn't. But the 1966 version doesn't have it.
Oh, he didn't add it back into there. Well, I think so. There's a letter, and I don't have it right in front of me. One of his letters where he actually mentions, he's like, no, I know where it is. It's in the it was Humphrey Carpenter actually mentioned that Tolkien, when he did the edit in 1966, he couldn't find these notes to go back and re-add them. And so
okay.
So
he had a few of them, but not many.
He had a few of them, but not many. And so what was chiefly in his brain, he actually had to go through it, that he actually didn't know where those were, didn't remember.
Well, that would make sense, and that makes some of this a shame. So he said, I wonder then if he had found those notes. That puts it in an entirely different light. So he never made the choice to stay playful and less serious.
Yeah, he ran out of time. So here's what Carpenter wrote in his biography, 1979, I think it was. I'll read the whole paragraph. "It has long been known that the last work Tolkien did on The Hobbit, the 3rd edition of 1966, came about at his publisher's request, since the appearance of the unauthorized ace paperbacks on The Lord of the Rings in the summer of 1965 meant that Houghton Mifflin and now Ballantine Books needed him to produce a revised authorized text in order to belatedly assert the American copyright. Humphrey Carpenter describes how Tolkien began. So he was forced to do this. He didn't really want to do this. So he was forced to throw in a bunch of edits. And Carpenter, in his book, Tolkien, a Biography, says this: Tolkien spent many hours searching for some revision notes that he had already made, but he could not find them. When the next day he did get down to The Hobbit, he found a good deal of it, quote, very poor, and had to restrain himself from rewriting the entire book. That sounds just like him. But yeah, even then he wanted to go back and rewrite it. But it's also just like him, where he doesn't ever finish the rewrite, right? He never finished so many of these stories. He would have these notes, and then he couldn't find them later and would have to rewrite those notes. So that's why we get 13. How many books in the history of Middle-earth? I can never remember. Is it 13?
13.
Anyway,
I think,
yeah. So that's why we get so many notes and why we have these different versions of different things, because he would lose these notes and then go find them. So yeah,
That's
I think it's
cool.
just oversight. I think it's just he remembered somebody mentioning that he's not really a man, so they did change it.
Yeah, that's the Arthur Ransom quote, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, so again, the specificity is gone, the charm is gone. Also, I think part of the charm, like, let me ask you this: what do you think? All the asides are gone. Like, what would you think? Like, well, okay, like Gandalf. Like, if you had heard all the things I'd heard about Gandalf, right? Or, what's another one? By some curious choice, like these little asides that he throws in that he all gets
Like
rid of.
one of I found funny was when Bilbo's speaking up for himself, and he says in the 66 version, he says, "All the same, I should like it all plain and clear," said he obstinately, putting on his business manner. And then here's the aside, usually reserved for people who tried to borrow money off of him.
Yeah,
and he removed that usually reserved part entirely from the rewrite.
Yes, yeah. And so do you think removing those asides makes it less charming, number one?
Yes.
And do you think it makes it any better?
It makes it more epic. So it moves it into a narrative style closer to Lord of the Rings and more epic, but it loses its charm. And I think that's the interesting tension that Tolkien is always trying, probably intuitively many times, to balance, which is the thing that makes one of the many things that makes the Hobbit and the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings so relatable to us, so attractive, is they feel real. They feel like domestic, normal characters. It's like, in the Lord of the Rings, it's like a world populated by mythical figures, and we identify with the hobbits. We don't identify with Aragorn. We don't identify with Legolas. We don't identify with Boromir. We don't identify with Gandalf. Okay? We identify with the hobbits and their domestic nature, their charm. That's one of the great hooks, I think, of Lord of the Rings, of the whole world that he made. But that hook depends on the Hobbit. That hook, like, there were no hobbits in the Silmarillion. And so there's this very interesting tension between the high epic narrative of the Silmarillion and the world of most of the world Lord of the Rings, and the domestic, childlike draw of the Hobbit and the charm and the playfulness of the hobbits. And I think that having them as two separate books is maybe it's happy circumstance, it's happy chance, right? If chance you call it. It's where you have one book which is very childlike, which is the Hobbit, very playful, very charming. They introduce us to the hobbits, and then now the hobbits become the main characters in Lord of the Rings, or some of the main characters. But then the whole tenor of the whole narrative voice changes, and now we're in what they call a narrative register, which is epic and no longer children's. And so I find all of this to be that tension between the playful, charming, domestic hobbits and the serious, dramatic, tragic, epic world of the Middle Earth. And I think in that tension lives so much of our attraction to Lord of the Rings across the spectrum in the world. Why it's beloved of so many people.
Yeah, and I think going back to rewrite something that didn't originally live in that tension and to create that is really difficult.
Very.
Because it's a natural thing. Like, as you're writing it, you're not thinking about how this tension lives. It's just a natural outpouring of the characters and the locations and the story. And when you go back to edit it, even though I think it was Orson Scott Card once said, like, the difference between a good book and a great book is about 100 revisions. That going back and revising after the success of it, and part of the reason for success is its charm, even though I might say, like, some of those asides I'm not a huge fan of. I think getting rid of maybe a few of those would have been okay. Particularly the first person one, when you're breaking that fourth wall and saying, like, if you had heard, like, when the narrator is speaking directly to you, I'm not a big fan of that, and getting rid of those I would be perfectly fine with. But when he changes confusticate and be bother these dwarves too.
Oh, that was I was going to bring that up. We lost our word of the week.
Yes,
listeners.
Right.
My word of the week was confusticate, and Tolkien took it from me this week.
And he just changed it to confound and bother
instead of confusticate and be bother. which
Yeah.
is so much better.
Yes, right. And bewildered and bewuthered became bothered and bewildered. And even the poetic nature of bewildered and bewuthered, right? There's a little bit of that sing-song nature of it to it that I like. That you get rid of it when he changed it to bothered and bewildered. And in looking at his changes, I feel like it's not even the excising of certain things that bothers me the most. It's just like the Rings of Power. It's not the adding of things or the removing of things. It's the changing of a lot of the things. And when you change the phrases and you change the tenor and the tone of the words that are being used, it changes it even more than getting rid of the line about, if you'd heard of the things of Gandalf, right? By changing the confusticate and be bother, it has that charm because it's an archaic language, they're real words, but he's using them here, and I think it gives it that sense of like there's a, I don't know, there's a playfulness to this because the words are more than just like he was annoyed, and which is really what Tolkien was saying with he's bothered now, and I didn't like that. That's where the good morning lines. Oh man, that confusticate, be bothered, bewildered, bewildered, and bewildered. Right? Those are the things that bothered me the most. And I'm a guy who I mean, I love poetry and English.
Did it be bother you?
It be bothered me very much.
You would be bothered.
I love like one of my favorite poems is Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll because of the sounds, and I love the sound of the language when it goes together. That's why I love Old English so much. Like the Lord's Prayer in Old English is such a wonderful sounding thing, and so when you get rid of the sound, the sound of wonderful prose, I appreciate very much. And there's much wonderful prose in The Hobbit, and I wish that he wouldn't have taken so much of it out. And I think that's the biggest loss in the rewrite.
1, 2, 1, 2, and through the Vorpal blade went snicker snack.
Yes, sir.
He
I
left
love it.
Dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. Great. Love Jabberwock. Jabberwocky. So there's a there is a real and it's great because there is a real Jabberwocky Lewis Carroll-ish element to that. And I think that Tolkien knew that, and he was deliberately trying to. He saw the higher register. I mean, after all, he wrote 3 books in the higher register, and his higher register epic was something that he found more worthy, and so he was trying to bring The Hobbit up into that register, and also correct some things. Which, because let's be frank, The Hobbit was a children's tale, spawned is the wrong word, sparked. Let's use that. Sparked by his own telling of a tale. I mean, like those asides and those narrator notes remind me like very much of a Tolkien with his back to the fire telling a story to his kids, and you have those kind of first person narrative notes that about the characters and talking to the listener, and that's perfectly appropriate for that register. But this is, and so I've been noticing that as I've been rereading The Hobbit here. I'll have a lot to say about that in chapter 2 as well, roast mutton, because there's a different register that is totally. It's fascinating to compare the world of Lord of the Rings to the world of The Hobbit, and then they're supposed to be the same world ultimately, but they're really not narratively. There's a lot of evidence of that, and so it's really fun, and it provides. And I don't even. It's not a problem to me. It's just a fun tension that makes a difference, and it's fun to notice and see all the details that make it so different. He talks about. Dragons in the original version, dragons knowing the market value of what they have, which he totally took out.
I'm okay with that one. I'm really fine with that one. However, we talked about specific things that were removed that that we can talk about. One of them made its way into the films, and Ian McKellen worded it very well when he says, "I am Gandalf," and Gandalf means me.
Yes.
He got rid of that. So let me read you the original line from The Hobbit. This is from the original Hobbit, not the 1960 edition. Yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know my name, though you don't remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. Okay, so that was the original Hobbit, and you like that was done in Peter Jackson's Hobbit and Ian McKellen's wonderful voice and wonderful rendition of Gandalf, and this is what he rewrote it to. Yes, yes, my dear sir, but I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you knew my name once when you were younger and brighter. It is Gandalf in this part of the world. Gandalf, do you hear? It again, the way he rewrote it, it loses the charm of the character of Gandalf.
Yep.
That sort of circular, like I'm Gandalf and Gandalf means me. It's the same sort of thought of like good morning, like I'm being like working with the words good morning, but here he's working with the word Gandalf, and Gandalf simply means Gandalf, and good morning simply means good morning. Right? I love that, and he lost that. I don't know if it's it's kind of like a lot of people when they're younger, they're more willing to take chances, and maybe that worked here. And Tolkien, like he was so caught up in trying to do the Silmarillion once he published the Lord of the Rings, at least mentally, that maybe that is affecting him in a negative, less approachable way. It makes these, I mean, certainly we can say the Silmarillion is far less approachable than The Hobbit. And I think that this rendition of The Hobbit is less approachable than what we are reading in every publication we get for it.
So what you're saying is you're glad he lost his notes.
Glad he lost his notes. Yes. I want to ask you to close up. I want to ask you one thing, and this comes from the author of this book. His name is John Rateliff. Rateliff, Rateliff.
Okay.
He says this about Bilbo, and this is what he says in regards to how Tolkien changed him, not just here, but also in like the quest. What is the Quest of Erebor? In that's in is that in the appendices? I think it's in the appendices, or is it in the unfinished?
I think it's the appendices. Yep.
Right. Okay, so he says this. Finally, Bilbo is made more foolish. Someone who, quote, loved maps and had his favorite walks all marked out on the neighborhood map made by himself. He would know what the dragon-haunted mountain they speak of is more than a day or two, or even a few days' walk away. Maps made in the Shire might tend to end at its borders, but he would certainly know that Thor's kingdom and Smaug's lair must lie outside those borders. And this naivety is extended beyond the end of the book. We are told that he got caught up in great events, which he never understood, and became enormously important, though he never realized it. But this contradicts the Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo took part in the Council of Elrond and learned, if he did not know already from Gandalf, that his ring was the One Ring, who its maker and master was, and what would happen if he regained it. He even volunteered to undertake the quest of Mount Doom himself, which is not so quixotic as it sounds, given that the quest was to rely on luck and stealth, not martial prowess. More importantly, contradicts the closing lines of The Hobbit itself, where Gandalf, who serves as Tolkien's spokesman more than any other character, assures Bilbo that he only played a small role in all these events. This diminishment of Bilbo, a central feature of the quest for Erebor, becomes even more pronounced in the next chapter. So do you think like he is making Bilbo more foolish in this rewrite? I mean, I guess what it says it's even more pronounced in the next chapter. It's what he's claiming in the It's what he's claiming how Tolkien changed him as he progressed in time too now.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I didn't see it as much. There's only two examples he gives from this chapter, and they didn't seem that. I mean, yes, I agree with him about the map example. I don't see it. He seemed like if you look at all of the words that Bilbo speaks in this first chapter, even in the rewrite and everything, the net effect isn't really to make him more foolish. He appears just like he does, to my mind. Those are very small details as well.
Yeah, it's a very surface level.
I feel like sometimes editors have to try to find a change, and I don't know that I agree that it's that big of a deal here. I do think the register change is the biggest deal, and for the rewrite. One of the things they lost, I didn't mention this before, but he completely took out the magic diamond studs from Beorn.
Right. Yes.
Gandalf doesn't do that anymore. He doesn't. No. He just does fireworks. Yeah. And also in the version that we're used to, Bag End is the largest hobbit hole in all of Hobbiton and the surrounding lands. But in the rewrite, it says, Bungo that was Bilbo's father built for her, that's Belladonna took, the most commodious hobbit hole that was to be found in that part of the Shire, always accepting the vast and many tunnel dwellings of the Tooks. So he's really pro Took much more in the in the rewrite. He even talks about more about the Tooks in a variety of other ways too. So there's I find, he's more concerned with Bilbo's lineage than he is, and telling us more about the Tookish side than he is in the version that we eventually came to know.
Yeah, he gets rid of superlatives a lot, right? He right there. He got rid of whatever the phrase was, the largest in all the Shire, right? It's no longer that.
Let me read the Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money. That's the aside, and he takes out the aside. That was to be found either under the hill or over the hill or across the water, and there they remain to the end of their days. So it's a big superlative. It's the biggest. It's the most luxurious that was to be found basically anywhere, and so there's no exception for the Tooks.
Right.
It's just the biggest.
Right, and he also. I think this is a change like that. He says originally when introducing Thorin in the original Hobbit, he's called enormously important, and instead of that, he says he has immense dignity, which is
Thorin is a little more serious.
Yes,
Thorin also recognizes when Bilbo's being silly, when Bilbo does the here at the end of the chapter. In the version we're familiar with, 1966 version. Gandalf covers for him, and then Thorin's a little sarcastic at the end. But in the new version, Thorin and Gandalf laugh at Bilbo when he does that. So Thorin's in the know. Thorin's a cannier character. Thorin's also more property driven, and I think the editor here pointed that out. So credit to him on that, where he's much more concerned about the stuff. And his legacy, and he even challenges Gandalf for not giving him the map earlier when he finds out it's been 91 years. So anyway, he's more of a, and what's interesting is I find that the Hobbit movies captured that. The Hobbit movies made Thorin much more of a heroic, epic figure, and the other dwarves less so. In the movies, and I found that to be more in line with Tolkien's rewrite, where Thorin is more like he's closer to Gandalf in terms of wisdom and seriousness, and the other dwarves are still the other dwarves.
I do like the two things that Tolkien got rid of that are, again, superlatives. One being, the way he describes Gandalf's eyebrows. Gandalf looked at him from under long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. They no longer stick out. They are now bristling beneath the brim of his hat. So that no longer
they don't stick out farther than his hat. Yep.
That's right. And Bilbo's pipe no longer goes down to his. I think he says his bushy.
His well curled toes.
Toes. He just gets rid of it. Right. They nearly reached down. The pipe nearly reached down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed. He just removed that. He's like, pipes don't reach down to your toes. Generally, that would be pretty tough. Imagine how hard it'd be to that.
Now that's quite a church warden right there. Yeah.
So anyway, guys, we could probably go on for a long, long time going through all these changes. But you can see the biggest change is definitely, I think we'd agree, Michael, the tone. Right, the tone is different. It's more stately. It's less charming, less playful. It has less superlatives. There is more time spent on making sure the details are right. So the years, making sure they have the instruments, like all that sort of stuff. And Tyler asked this, and we were going to do this in our extended podcast, but we'll just do it here because I know you guys are all wondering, which do we prefer more, the 1966 edition, 1960 edition? Well, I will probably say a combination of that, getting rid of some of the first person calls or second person calls. I'm like, what would you think about this here? I don't like those. I do like the specificity of the years and things like that, but I hate how he's changing the prose. I think he needed to keep the prose as much the same as possible. So if you ask me which one would I prefer right now, if I got a whole book that was in this style or a whole book that was in the 1966 revision style, which was really more the 1937 edition, I'd go with that. I don't like this rewrite as much as I like the original.
I wonder, I actually agree with you. So I would say the same. I wonder how much the fame of the Lord of the Rings was based upon the fame of the Hobbit. I never looked into that. How did he have a fan base prior to the 1950s? were they looking for it from him? Had he promised something?
Well, he did they wanted a Hobbit sequel in 1938, but it took 14 years.
Right, but then there's this little thing called World War II that happens between. So I don't know how much people held on to that. It's a different world back then. This was not the social media world where you have a fan base that just is always pinging you. It's to finish your darn.
I would imagine
Song of Ice and Fire books.
So here's the way that I would imagine it is like he had a name, people knew who he was. As specific, the Hobbit sold very well. It went through many different printings.
Makes sense.
The people who read it in 1937, 1938, when the Lord of the Rings got published, say you read it at 10 years old, you're now 24, you're married, you have your first kid. That's something you're going to think about. Like, oh, I loved The Hobbit when I was a child. Oh, he's writing, I want to read this now. So I'm sure there was some sort of built-in recognition of this. And it hit at a great time, 15 years after he published The Hobbit, for those who originally read The Hobbit and found it something that was well loved, and so they had that emotional resonance with the story of The Hobbit, and they wanted that emotional resonance again, because he always tried to refine. It's been many decades, and I still can't find that Lord of the Rings shaped hole in my heart to be replaced by anything else but the Lord of the Rings. So
it's true. It's fascinating. I've never been more clear about the difference between them, and as I am now. I always have seen The Hobbit as a more childlike book when I've been reading it many times to my children, but I've never been real clear about the change in register and in the specificity as I was when going through the rewrite attempt. So thank you, kudos to you for bringing this to our attention and getting us to talk about it.
Yeah, it makes you, like you said, it makes you really think differently about The Hobbit, and you realize how different it really is. And if it was in that tone originally, would I have enjoyed it as much when I read it as a really young child? Or my 8-year-old who's reading it, would he enjoy it less if it was in that tone? Probably. And so I'm glad he didn't finish it. That's my takeaway. I'm glad he didn't finish it. So Tyler,
yeah, I'm glad he didn't too. Here's an interesting thought. What would the world be like if he had continued to and written The Lord of the Rings in the Hobbits register?
Oh man,
what would that story be like? I mean, obviously you'd have to change some of the elements of that story. Ring wraiths and things like that are just not, and fell beasts. Well, fell beasts can be, but ring wraiths, I don't think that and the whole Frodo turning into a wraith thing, and that's just, there's so many elements that are just wouldn't make it, but they could be more childish or childlike, and that would be a fascinating thing to see. I mean, it would only be Tolkien that could do it, but it would be interesting.
It's hard imagining what it would be like without actually seeing it. For sort of like reading The Hobbit, like if you were to read it and say like, okay, if I were to imagine this in like the tonal register of The Lord of the Rings, what would it be like? It's very hard to do without actually seeing it, because we're not the author and we don't have that in our head. So I don't know what that would be like.
Right, but you can see so you can take a couple, just real briefly, you can take a couple of elements, like compare the elves of Rivendell in The Hobbit, which we're going to talk about, to the elves of Rivendell of The Lord of the Rings. Take the battle of the Battle of the Five Armies and the brevity of the description. I mean, literally, Tolkien has Bilbo just knocked out and then
paragraph.
tells you about it, versus, because for a child, like the going through of the gory details of the battle, I don't mean literally gory, although sometimes, but we just reread the Battle of Pelennor Fields to my kids, and it's brutal, man. It's awesome too. It makes it, the Theoden's speech before the charge of the Rohirrim is like, brings a tear to the eye. It's gorgeous prose, and so stirring. And I just don't think that The Hobbit can reach that in that style. That style just isn't appropriate for it. And so your battles would be like a paragraph or two, and then there would be all these funny elements thrown in. I can't help but think one of the funny things is that is what some of the elements of Tolkien's Hobbit movies feel like. I'm not Tolkien's, Jackson's Hobbit movies feel like to me. They feel like a childish, I mean, they're bad, but a childish version of the Lord of the Rings world, brought more to life. And it's bad. It's just not good. He puts in all these childish elements, everything from the poop on Radagast's head to the interactions between the elves and dwarves, and Andrew, that character from Lake Town, and I mean, just all this silliness.
Yeah, and the dwarves in the extended edition bathing in the fountains of Rivendell, naked.
Oh my gosh, yeah,
that was the worst. Speaking of the Hobbit, then go ahead.
No, that's it. I think we're ending here.
We got to close it down, man. We don't want to bore everybody. No, I mean, nobody listening to us who's a fan of Tolkien is going to be bored by anybody talking about Tolkien, right? We're going to go into our extended edition where we will talk about the Hobbit movie a little bit more, because we're going to talk about two things. One, we're going to talk about what is a good thing that Peter Jackson changed in the Hobbit, and number two, what should Tolkien have changed in the 1966 revision that he didn't change? We're going to talk about that and see if we can agree on what that is, and if we actually find some disagreement on what he should have changed. All right. So if you want to get that, go to thewonder.com/member, become a member, become a sponsor, give a little bit more, like Lynn and Rich, and join our Discord chat where we talk about these things and we get those questions to be asked directly, like Tyler did, about whether we prefer, which rewrite do we prefer. So anyway, I'll also put a link down to the History of the Hobbit where you can get this on Amazon. It's where, I mean, it's very in-depth read of the Hobbit, even the chapters leading up to, because there's so many notes. It's 1,000 pages about the Hobbit, and remember, the Hobbit is only 180, depending on which copy you have. So anyway, check that out. thewondering.com/member. You want to check us out over there, guys? We want you to join us. Join us or die. No. Okay. No, we're moving on. Guys, freeloaders, thank you.
Goodbye, freeloaders.